Lutherans number the seventh commandment. If you're a Christian from a different tradition, you might have this as number 8. But it's the thou shalt not steal commandment. There are 2 places that the 10 commandments appear in the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. And both of them contain the 10 commandments. Actually, in Hebrew, it's the 10 words. It is the Hebrew word for no, lo, and then whatever the word is. So this is lo, don't, and this one is steal. And so there's like don't steal, don't kill, don't, and sometimes you can look at both lists and you can spot minor differences, and you can say, oh, that's because Exodus chapter 20, both written by Moses, but Exodus chapter 20 is like right after the mountain. You've seen the movie. Charlton Heston comes down carrying the stones. Deuteronomy is the repetition, the ditto at the end. This is Deuteronomy is a series of sermons that Moses preaches right before the people enter the promised land, right before he dies. So that's kind of his life summary. And this is what God did for us. Remember this when we walk into the new land. So sometimes you'll find, like a preacher, that there's a nuance, there's an expansion, there's a change. The substance stays the same, but on the don't steal, no major change in the text. However, in other parts of the Old Testament, you'll start to see how this don't steal fits in. In fact, among Jewish scholars of the 10 Commandments, you will sometimes find the you shall not steal specifically related to slavery and human trafficking. And they think it's a nuance that it's because of some of the punishments that are meted out, it must involve the capital offense of what we would now call human trafficking. Most other scholars, and even a majority of Jewish scholars would go, no, we think this covers not just human trafficking, but all forms of stealing. So in do not steal, in the Leviticus 19 tradition, includes things like the laws on gleaning. If you read Ruth, you understand the rules on gleaning. That was it's a directive from God to help the community, especially those who are struggling. And it says, when you harvest your grain and a few pieces fall out, don't go back and pick them up. Leave them for the orphan, the widow, the poor folks that need some help. They can come through and glean after you. And that's how Ruth meets Boaz. She's gleaning to take care of her and her mother-in-law. So under stealing, Leviticus 19 lists gleaning. That if you remove that, if you collect absolutely everything and don't leave anything for your poor neighbor, you should think about God's law on stealing here, because you are robbing from God's plan to take care of those who are struggling. Got a quick story from Mike Clark. Really was a quick story. Mike said, when they ran Hygiene Grocery, he and his brother learned from their dad. Every year on New Year's Day, his dad would take the outstanding bills of the folks they knew in the community that were struggling, and he would burn them. And they would start every year with a fresh. So he would give up that potential profit. Just said, look, they're not going to be able to pay me, and let's not carry this over. Let's just get rid of it. That was their family rule for how do we take care of our neighbors. So a modern day equivalent of gleaning. Mike was relating to the Old Testament that said, don't have 2 sets of weights, don't have 2 sets of measures. And he said, we had honest scales. Literally, the name of the scale was Honest Scale Company. He said, but you put the stuff on and you still had to read it, And he said I had a tradition, that I knew I had a mom with 10 kids, okay? So I'd stand up and look down on the scale so that it looked like she had less, and so instead of like, oh, it could be 7 pounds, Mike said it was closer to 6 by the time I was done, that this was just how you took care of people. So that was part of the stealing in Leviticus describing the larger law. There's the typical things about deception, defrauding, and robbing, but also holding back wages, particularly when you're dealing with day laborers. These guys need to get paid at the end of the day because they go then and they buy food, and that's what their family eats that night. If you don't pay them, if you say, I'm sorry, I left my wallet at home, their family goes hungry. Before Judy, I dated another church-going Christian girl in the Assemblies of God. And they got saved out of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Their words, not mine. And they don't get me wrong, they were a devout family. And I remember one Friday afternoon, I was picking Kim up, we were going to go out, and the wife was saying, oh, honey, you're not feeling good, stay home. And he was like, nope, I've read the Bible, and it is payday. And I have got to go in and make sure everybody gets their pay because God says, don't withhold wages from laborers. And it was like, okay. And then finally, also included in stealing is if you treat people unequally, if you make a distinction between foreigners and natives, you're guilty of stealing. If you have one price here and one price there, or you just however you deal with it. God says, no, we foreigners and native-born, you treat them alike. And then finally it ends with, don't use dishonest standards when measuring weight, length, or quantity. It's a translation. Use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. Ephah and hin were measuring. One was a big measure, one was a little measure. And just make sure that you are being absolutely integrity. Had an interesting experience in Spain. We came in from, Spanish people like dinner starts like 9 p.m., okay? So it was like, oh, come on, guys. Anyhow, we were out doing something, got back, and we hadn't had dinner, and so we just ordered food, there was a bar lobby thing, and people kept coming in and joining us. We got a bottle of wine, and then I finished up my bill, got up to the room, and I looked at it, and I went, oh, they didn't charge for one of the entrees. But there was another guy sitting at the same table with us, checked with him the next morning, did you get charged for 2 entrees? No, I just got charged for 1. So I went to the bar and said, I owe you for an entree from last night. And they looked at me like I had 2 heads. Like, you got away with it. And I'm like, yeah, I owe you 15 euro. Let's just settle up right here. And they were like, we have no way to go back. It's yesterday, it's closed, just take it with our compliments. And I'm like, okay. But that's how we treat the Seventh Commandment. It's not just about robbery and theft. It's about all of our dealings with our neighbors. So I didn't know Mike's stories, but I always loved this Saturday Evening Post cover. So shopkeeper has got his thumb on the scale, and the woman has got her hand under the scale. So this, when you read the Old Testament, this is primarily what the Seventh Commandment is talking about. Yes, it covers violent crime and all those other things, but most of the passages and a lot of the prophetic message is about treat each other with respect, treat each other as equals, don't rip each other off. God doesn't care how big your pile gets. He does care how you get your pile. And trust me, in the end, God says, it's all my stuff anyhow.
That should be the same for like tourists and locals?
Sure. Don't get me wrong. I understand why in some cases you're going to give a tour guide a discount because he just brought in 20 people, and you're going to go, your coffee is on the house today. I get that. But yeah, exactly. When you're a tourist, you're not going to get ripped off. So I'm reading and listening to podcasts and trying to figure out what the role of is AI in future ministry, and how do you use artificial intelligence. One of our elders, Dan Magyar, makes sense, computer guy, did a devotion once, and he said he fed into AI, I want a devotion on this idea, and I want it from a Lutheran perspective. And he said, I read it, and I went, I think we kind of missed it here, missed it there. But, read it at elders. We always have a devotion at the start of our meetings. And, the consensus of the elders was pretty good devotion. One of the decrees that has come down as an agreement among preachers is you can't use AI to write your sermon. You can use it as a resource to help, particularly if you're long-winded. You could run it through AI and say, how do you make this shorter? People were definitely going, that's a good use of AI. But they said, no, you can't just, on Saturday afternoon say, hey, give me 12 minutes on the Seventh Commandment. But so I just, for fun, typed in to Google, how do Lutherans understand thou shalt not steal? And the first answer that comes up now is all developed by AI, and then you have the old Google with the websites underneath it. And so I said, let's play with it. And they said, in Lutheran teaching, Seventh Commandment, so they got that right. You shall not steal, cite the Bible passage, extends beyond simply taking physical items. And I went, that is a true sentence. It encompasses all forms of dishonest and fraudulent business practices. And I went, that's true. But me being me, I did a reality check, and I pulled out the large catechism. In the Lutheran Confessions, there's a book called The Book of Concord, and it contains within it all of the confessional documents of the Lutheran Church that came from Luther and the time right after him, where they were having discussions where people were going, okay, you must believe this. No, we believe this, but not that. We believe this, but not that. And it's that very clear, lawyer-like language of, we're in agreement on, with the Roman Catholic Church. They said, we're in agreement on the doctrine of the Trinity. We have no differences with you on that. And so that section's really small. And then there's other sections where it's like, oh no, here we have some differences. We agree with you here, we disagree with you here. We believe this, but we don't believe that. We accept this, we reject that. And those are, like when I got ordained, they asked me, do you believe the Bible is true and will you preach according to God's word? And I said, yes. Will you use the Lutheran confessions, particularly the unaltered Augsburg Confession, will you be governed by those documents? And I said, yes. At seminary, you study them. At college, I started to study them. I had a lead-in. One of my summer traveling teams with ongoing Ambassadors for Christ, we would stay with host families, and we'd do evangelism things at churches. And then usually there'd be Lutheran, there'd be a potluck, and then you'd go off to your host family. And I ended up in this farmhouse with one of the most thoughtful and intelligent women I have ever met. She and her husband, just were running, it looked like a model farm to me, being a city kid. And he was a man of very few words. He was much more comfortable out in the barn, so he kind of said, hi, welcome, I'm out of here. But it ended up chatting with this woman for hours, and I was 15 at the time, and she said, well, according to the Lutheran Confessions, and I was like, yeah, I keep hearing that phrase, what does that mean? And she said, you got confirmed, and I said, yeah, and she said, well, small catechism, yeah. She goes, you know about the large catechism? I said, I've heard about it. She reaches out and she pulls out a copy of The Book of Concord, translated by Robert Tappert. And she was like, this is it, and I've been reading these and working with them, and she taught Sunday school and all these other things. And I was fascinated, okay, which tells you something about me at 15. I'll admit, I did not date a lot. But anyhow, when I got home, I ordered my own copy of the Book of Concord. And at 15, I started reading the Book of Concord. Parts of it are slow going, I will tell you that. But part of it is the large catechism. And the large catechism, Luther wrote the small catechism for families to display in their home. We now do it in little tiny books so that you can stick it in your Bible or have it handy. Back then, they were printed much more on broadsheets, and they were like you could put it up on the wall like art, because that was that brand new technology of the printing press. And people and back then they had content problems. Authors did not get paid for their content, but printers got paid for printing. So if you could find something that people wanted, like Luther's stuff, because he was this exciting new thought thinker, printers would print everything Luther said and wrote. That's why we have 54 volumes of Luther's works, and people would buy it, and it would be pennies, but then particularly like the small catechism was written, and that's why the head of every section is the way the head of the household shall teach the members of the family. I think in German it's the way the father should teach. And it was designed to be stuck up on the wall so you'd see it, like religious art. So I reality checked AI. And the large catechism, I paraphrased here, all the prohibitions on stealing extend to all our relationships with our neighbor. So, yeah, I think the AI was accurate on here's what Lutherans believe about stealing. And second thing was that it also includes the positive duty to help our neighbor to protect and improve what belongs to them, property and income. And again, using the large catechism, we are commanded to promote and further our neighbor's interest. And when he suffers want, we are to help, share, and lend to both friends and foes. So a little expansion. AI did not get the idea that we help out even the people we don't like because they are our neighbor, which goes back to Jesus' teaching in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because who is it that actually helps? The hated Samaritan, the enemy, the people where people would avoid walking into Samaritan territory, where James and John are like, let's call down lightning strikes on them because they were rude. And there's an expansion here that's part of who we are. When he suffers want, we help. There's an interesting theology coming out of Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, because the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is becoming a much more worldwide movement. You might remember Vicar Solomon from Madagascar. There are way more Lutherans in Madagascar than there are in America. When I started ministry, there were about 1.1 million Missouri Synod Lutherans in church on Sunday. On any given Sunday, 1.1 million of us showed up. We are now down to about 400,000 on any given Sunday in the 37 some odd years that I've been in ministry. It's just a profoundly different world. And so I had like Dr. G, who is from the Korean Lutheran Church, which is a big growing Lutheran church. But we also have some guys who are coming out of Latin America where the Lutheran Church is growing. And there's been this real struggle in the Missouri Synod because the Missouri Synod leans politically right. And there are people who are like, we kind of, what do we do then with the anti-immigrant stuff when the Bible's saying, no, we treat everybody the same, and how do we deal with this? Gonzalez, literally his name is Gonzalez, had in the last Concordia Journal had a really nice article saying, here's our confessional stance on how we handle immigrants. And he went back to, when Luther was coming up, there were still plagues and there were still battles going on. And when there'd be a plague in one town, a lot of people would leave. And a bunch of people showed up in Wittenberg, and they were actually leaving from some battle. One prince was going up against one duke or something, and they were just like, we're out of here. And the people of Wittenberg were going, who are these people and how do they fit? Kind of small town thinking. And Luther was preaching and saying, these are our neighbors. Even if you don't know them, they are your neighbors. And you have to, and that became a series of, and he was going, this is our Lutheran understanding of how we treat immigrants, legal or illegal. These people are our neighbor. You don't have to like it, but this is from Luther how we treat people who are dispossessed and are here. Interesting letters to the editor following that. But for the large catechism, the Seventh Commandment includes how you take care of others. How are we going to handle the ending of SNAP benefits, or the problems that are going to occur. I had to do a little bit of work because I saw somebody posting kind of this. There's 11,000 jobs available in Longmont, and with kind of like, why do we need SNAP? And there's a white paper that goes state by state. 60% of the people in Colorado that get SNAP are working at least one job. But, if you're trying to rent an apartment here in Longmont, that's going to take 60, 70% of your income. And so they're going, yeah, these are working poor folks. There's other 40%, a lot of those folks are disabled. Or their grandma and grandpa taking care of grandkids because, somebody died from an overdose or something like that. And it was one of those gigs where I just had to say, here's some facts. Let's bring some facts into this debate. Let's not just posture around on it. So here's what I think AI missed on and this is just great fun from Luther for the consequences of those who steal. First off, he said, you're going to risk earthly punishments. And Luther's quote is, for every penny you have taken, you'll have to pay it back 30-fold. How much does that, remember the promise that Zacchaeus made? Yep, I will pay it back 4 times over. But so Luther was like, first off, if you get caught, German law says you're going to have to repay. He does spend a lot of time saying, we talk about, we like to focus on the sneak thief. He said, what you need to worry about are the princes and the folks who sit in, the German says swivel chairs. And I'm not sure if they mean like an executive swivel chair or if they just meant like they're duplicitous. But he was like, those are the people who are really stealing. Those are the ones you got to watch. But he also says, hey, folks, we risk God's displeasure and we will not escape his wrath and punishment. And this is earthly wrath, earthly punishment. This is not eternal consequences unless you live apart from Jesus. But God will pay them what they deserve. People who steal, Luther says, will scrape and scratch day and night, but they're just never going to get ahead. And he kind of foreshadows the Third Amendment to the Constitution. He says that if you steal and build yourself a magnificent house, when there's a war, they're going to quarter foreign troops in your house because it's nice enough. And when they leave, they're not going to leave anything behind. And they're going to steal you blind. And so he sees that as an affliction. And his most famous quote is, God punishes one thief by another thief. Luther says, if we tried to hang everybody who was guilty of breaking the Seventh Commandment, we would run out of hangmen, we would run out of trees, and pretty soon there'd be no people left on earth. This is one that we all struggle with because we all like stuff and feel secure when we have more stuff. So there is, however, another thing that AI missed, a blessing to obedience in the Seventh Commandment. And Luther writes, whoever desires and seeks good works will find here more than enough that are heartily acceptable and pleasing to God. And in addition, are favored and crowned with excellent blessings that are to be richly compensated for what we do for our neighbor. So we take care of our neighbor for his good and from friendship. King Solomon, Proverbs 19, he that hath pity on the poor lendeth unto the Lord, and that which he hath given, he, God, will pay him again. So Luther says, in the end, remember, it's all God's stuff. And he's a rich Lord, and he's entrusted it to us, and it's certainly sufficient for you, and for you not to suffer. So quit stealing because you're worried about not having enough, but you can enjoy it instead with a joyful conscience, 100 times more than you could scrape together through unfaithfulness and through wrong. So like Mike was telling me after the first service, talking about the hygiene grocery store, he said, the folks that you helped, that were struggling, he said, the most loyal customers. So when the big grocery chains opened up, they were like, yeah, no, we're still shopping here. We'll be here, Clark family, because you guys took care of us when we were in trouble. My dad ran a small business, and I remember when it started to do well. And he said, yeah, got another fancy lunch from a banker today. And they were like, we would love to loan you some money. And my father was always like, where were you when we were struggling? Because the savings and loan took care of us, and you bankers didn't. And they were always like, curses, foiled again. So, key principles. This is going back to AI plus some of my own thoughts here. Underlying this whole thing is the doctrine, or the modern idea of private property. That there really is, individuals have a right to own property. We do it as stewards of God's property, but stealing would violate that. And particularly, this was really important for Lutherans, and one of the reasons they fought against communism and certain forms of socialism. Because they said, no, God has entrusted it to me, not to the state. And I'm responsible to God for it. Did I tell you the story of my grandmother withholding the means of production? So this was my grandmother who never learned English. She lived in the Volga Valley, and as the Russian Revolution came, the folks from Moscow came, and they were, so that would have been the Red Army. So they were going to collectivize everything, right? And the folks in the Volga Valley, Ukraine's a little bit further down, but they were like, no, we don't think that somebody from Moscow knows how to handle things. And my grandmother was a good seamstress, and she had a pair of really nice German scissors. For ladies who sew, you know how important your scissors are. And so she hid them and did not, when they came to collectivize everything and collect the animals and the grain and the seed and everything else, because the state is going to run it and do it. She was like, I don't trust you. She didn't have a southern accent. She was German. But she absolutely refused to give up her scissors. Nobody narked on her, so she lived. And as a result, I'm here. Her husband had already left for the New World, and then my grandmother ended up like 10 years kind of living as a refugee with a bunch of kids because he was over earning the money to get their tickets, and the Russian Revolution came in the meantime. Long story there. So, broad definition of stealing, it's meant to cover all sorts of actions beyond common theft. So dishonest business practice, workplace misconduct. Luther spends a lot of time on laziness and negligence. And he's directing it at the servant class, and he's saying, hey, if your master tells you to do something, you're responsible to do it. But he also then says to the master, he says, you can't beat somebody for an honest mistake. So if they break something, it's not necessarily a sign of negligence. It may just be that it broke. And so don't beat them for doing that. But then also included in this was just plain unfair systems that would exploit the vulnerable, or even advocating for such an unjust system. and this is where socialism and property rights come in, that would strip people of private property. And then breaking promises, particularly in business deals. The theft there is, it could be the theft of sort of opportunity cost. I will lead you along and then not fulfill the deal. And in the meantime, you've missed other opportunities. Or you just didn't follow through. And finally, intellectual property, which is what I'm doing right now by using AI, taking text, images, and streaming services, but I'm acknowledging that's what I'm doing. So, key principles of do not steal. There is that positive command to help. So, how are you functioning in your community? Are you there to help? And as we help our neighbor, I mentioned it in the sermon, it's all God's stuff anyhow. Like all the commandments, the seventh commandment, yes, it leads us to, I am unable to keep the law on my own, I need Jesus, but it's also empowered by God's Holy Spirit. We live with honesty, integrity, and generosity, reflecting what God has done for us. So how do you witness in dark times? Quick personal story. This is not a pat on the back. This is just, here is what I find works. On the tour, we were with a Rick Steves group, so lots of good public television watching folks, okay? And lovely people and we're having a grand time. In fact, ran into another Missouri Synod Lutheran couple, and we knew a pastor in common, so we had a great breakfast together. But I end up hanging out with some folks that are like far from God and Jesus and church. And when they found out I was clergy, they were like, we're not quite sure what to do with this. But we were already connecting at this point. One of the little ladies that is with us has some vision problems, so I would always help her down steps. She just can't sense, kind of what I practice in the parking lot here. And then, they'd see me doing things, and they were like, why are you always doing that? And I'm like, well, for one, I struggle with depression, and it helps me. So that's what I've learned. And they're like, oh, okay, so there's a selfish motive. And I said, and second of all, we get to create the community we live in. I watched a man who absolutely changed property values in Louisiana. He lived in a small neighborhood called the St. Streets, and his house was a corner house. He had beautiful gardens, and he waved at everybody that came by. And pretty soon they started waving back, and the St. Streets developed this reputation as being the friendly place to live. And you watched, now this was in the 80s, you watched property values go up by like $10,000 and $20,000, which was huge. People wanted to live there. He created that community. I watched that happen and I went, there's a lesson here. We get to create the community we live in by the way we treat one another. The more helpful we choose to be, the more kind we choose to be. Whether it's deserved or not, you and I may have to take the lead on this, but we end up creating a community that's far more fun to live in because it's more kind, it's more helpful. Not just when I have trouble, but it just is generally nicer. And, long conversation over a bottle of wine, I lay out this whole thing and they're like, wow. And I'm like, okay, so just going to sound like a pastor for a minute. All this is Jesus teaching, love your neighbor. I mean, that's it. Just a pure moral teaching. The more you love your neighbor, the more it's fun to live in the neighborhood. And they were like, I got to think about that. And I'm like, please do. And, we're still texting, corresponding. That's a way to bring good news of God and a witness to Jesus in a way that's not, let's argue about this hot button issue. But how do we just choose to live, and how do we choose to form the community we get to live in? Because everybody likes living on a tour group where people are helpful to each other. So one of the tricks is, right, you get on the bus, you make sure you're the person that bought the whole bag of candy, and you pass it around. And it absolutely changes the vibe on the bus. And people are like, oh, it's a party as we drive from one place to another, you and I, we get to form that in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our congregation. We get to change the atmosphere that we live in by how we choose to live. The Seventh Commandment is guidance on how to do that. We live with integrity because it makes a difference on how we get to all live together. All the commandments end up with the promise, if you do this, you will live long in the land. And what God was saying is, when we treat each other with respect, the community will survive. And you will have a long time in the promised land. When they lost that, and that's what the prophets kept preaching against, God sent Assyrians and Babylonians and other people to punish and say, nope, I'm not going to let this continue. All right, I got to go upstairs. Go in peace, serve the Lord. I will listen to questions and comments. If you would just leave this